Buckeyes and Wolverines set to square off at high noon, as it should be, as we welcome in Tony Gerdeman from BuckeyeHuddle.com. Gerd, thank you for joining us to help us break down the game.
Wouldn't want to be anywhere else talking about the game.
Perhaps a little bit of an admission that some of the Ohio State Buckeyes didn't take the game as seriously as perhaps others do the last couple of seasons, as we heard from Jim Knowles and Denzel Burke earlier this week, that they had to experience the game to understand it, which is certainly hasn't been as big of a case as it has been the last couple of years.
Yeah, and this is something I've tried to explain to Buckeye fans who get super mad at losing to Michigan and think a head coach should be fired for doing so. You are not entitled to this game. You're not entitled to winning it. Players aren't entitled to winning it. Just because the 10 classes before you won this game doesn't mean that it's something that happens every November. It's like after finals, you are entitled to a win over Michigan. That's not how it is. You have got to go and do it. It isn't given to you. It isn't just something that is part of your scholarship. And so it takes, sometimes it takes losing the game to understand and appreciate why nobody wants to lose it, because that's when you learn, that's when the pain sets in, as Denzel Burke talked about it. Jim Knowles talked about the feeling of letting people down. And you think you know what the game means, but you really know what it means when you haven't provided that win to everybody who is expecting it. Not that necessarily expecting it is something that should be an annual thing, but wanting it, needing it, that sort of thing, you just can't feel entitled to it. And now they certainly don't, because they've lost the last two.
It was refreshing to hear both Marvin Harrison Jr. and Emeka Egbuka talk about they don't have gold pants. And it wasn't that long ago where we had Ohio State players trading gold pants for discounted tattoos. And that shows you how much that trinket means to them. And it's been taken away the last couple of years. And that is very much providing motivation for this Buckeye team, particularly that class that hasn't won against Michigan, partially because 2020 Michigan backed out of the game.
Yeah, you have to go to the redshirt seniors of this year who have gold pants. Even the senior class doesn't, the 2020 class. So this is a thing that I don't even know the last class. Probably should go back and look. The last class that the last 4 years that didn't have a senior went through Ohio State and didn't have a pair of gold pants by the time they were out. Probably have to go back to the 80s, I would assume, at some point, or the early 90s. And that's 30 years ago we're talking. And so this, as I said, it's not an entitlement, it's an expectation. And when you don't have it, you're missing something, because this is something that all of the alumni, before you talk about, this is, it's just part of the conversation. How many gold pants did you have? How many did you win? What'd you do with your gold pants? That's a question, Mark. That is a question we have asked players. We used to ask players every year, what'd you do with your last pair? Who'd you give your last pair to? Oh, I gave it to my mom. I gave it to my sister. I gave it to my grandmother. We have not that's not a question we've been asking lately in the last few years, because there are no gold pants. And so this is something that you're measured by the wins over Michigan, whether you're a head coach, whether you're a player, especially as a quarterback. And when you don't have that on around your neck, literally or figuratively, then something is missing. And there is some, you're judged a little bit by that as well.
You don't get gold pants for a tie. So 88, 89, 90, 91, 92, 93, those classes never had gold pants. They did not beat Michigan. And then the first win was from 87 to 94. What does Ohio State need to do to get the win this Saturday in Ann Arbor?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think if this comes down more to maybe Ohio State outscoring in a small way, like I think Ohio State's defense is going to be fine. I think Michigan's defense is it's going to be a relatively low scoring. So it takes Ohio State's offense, I think, to get over that hump, get to that next step, get into the 20s. And that's obviously being able to run the ball. If for the last almost 30 years now, the team that runs the ball with the higher yards per carry wins the game. And you have to go back a long way to find a point in time where that didn't happen. I think in 2013, they both averaged the same amount of yards per carry, but Ohio State outrushed Michigan in that game. If you run the ball better than the opponent, you're generally going to win this game. It's like the old Urban Meyer stat: if you block a punt in a game and return it for a touchdown, your winning percentage goes up into the 90s. If you outrush your opponent in this game, your winning percentage, your win probability, which is a statistic that I can't stand, goes way, way up. And sometimes that's just because you're running the clock out and you're keeping the ball away. But establishing the run, getting that yards per carry, there's really no substitute for it. And if you can't get it, then you're putting it on the shoulder of your quarterback, the legs of your quarterback. You're trying to find those yards somewhere else, and you have to execute at a much higher level throwing the ball when you can't get those 5, 6, 7 yards per carry.
Let's talk a little bit about the Ohio State offensive line. It seems like over the last couple of weeks, perhaps the tackles have solidified themselves a little bit more, but now there's more concerns about the interior portion of that line, which is a little disconcerting because considering Donovan Jackson and Matthew Jones were the returners on the line, they've been having issues. There's been talk about maybe moving Matthew Jones to center because of Carson Hinsman, the freshman, having issues. With the way this offensive line is playing right now, and I suppose this is the caveat's going to be the way TreVeyon Henderson is running right now. Can Ohio State win the rush attack and thus win the game?
I think they can. I think maybe some of that running goes outside the tackles rather than inside the tackles because Michigan's defensive tackles are really good. They're big, they're strong. And the interior of Ohio State's line with Carson Hinsman sometimes struggling to get to his blocks or sustain his blocks, that creates some issues. But when you have TreVeyon Henderson's speed and ability to get outside, that opens some things up. Xavier Johnson, the way they utilize him in the two back sets, running some outside stuff with him, jet sweeps with Marvin Harrison and Emeka Egbuka, they can do some things outside. They're still going to try to run between the tackles because this is Big Ten football after all. And you've got to establish that and just keep a defense honest in that way. So if you're talking about out rushing Michigan, that also talks about that. That also brings into account Michigan's running game. Their running game has struggled. Only once in their last 5 games have they averaged over 4 yards per carry. And I think if you're under 4 yards per carry in this game, you're going to have a tough time winning.
The Michigan offensive line, last 2 years, they've won the Joe Moore Award as the best offensive line in the nation. They're one of the semifinalists this year, but I think it's patently clear they're not as dominant of an offensive line as they have been in years past. There are some injuries. They say everybody's going to be healthy. Now, they've certainly played a lot of depth this year, but the last couple of weeks, maybe for a couple of different reasons, it seems as if that Michigan offense is not as dynamic as we saw at the beginning of this season.
Yeah, it's not been, and I think the one area we can definitely point to is that the competition finally got better. It took all season for them to get to the Penn State game and the Maryland game. And when we're talking about Maryland as being one of the top teams they've played, that gives you an idea of the schedule that they've played. But that offensive line, they were missing their left tackle last week. Carson Barnhart, their normal right tackle, started the season, I think, as a left tackle and then had to move to the right side because he was struggling there. And then he struggled against Penn State. They were running right by him. I think that was one of the reasons Michigan didn't throw the ball at all in the second half. They were protecting J.J. McCarthy in that way. That was the best way to protect him, was to let him hand the ball off. He's also running the ball a little bit, got banged up, which might be another factor this week. But it's going to be interesting to see how they protect their offensive linemen. And I think one of the ways to do that is they'll go with 6 offensive linemen, 2 tight ends. They're gonna bulk up, try to control the line of scrimmage that way, try to protect the pass rushers. They try to keep Carson Barnhart protected from, be it Jack Sawyer, JT Tuimoloau, any of the young defensive ends for Ohio State. Protect JJ McCarthy most of all. But yeah, it's been a little concerning. And the Joe Moore Award, the semifinalist, that to me is it's surprising because they have not played up to that level. They spent the first 4, 5, 6 games of the season trying to find an offensive line that worked for them. I don't think they necessarily have, because the running game has not been as effective as they would like. Certainly not as effective as it was last year. And again, if you can't run in this one, you're going to have to be able to throw it to win it or get some timely turnovers. And neither of these two teams have really been that giving in that area.
It's no secret that Ohio State and Michigan tend to recruit a lot of the same players, and that was the case a few years ago at the quarterback position with J.J. McCarthy and Kyle McCord. One of the interesting subplots that has come out this week is McCord and McCarthy consider themselves friends. They've known each other for a number of years, growing up and going to these different quarterback competitions together, but ultimately Ryan Day and Ohio State chose Kyle McCord instead of J.J. McCarthy, and now there's some discussion about, well, Kyle McCord has to prove that Ryan Day made the right decision 4 years ago.
Yeah, that was always going to be one of the fascinating side points to this game. We've talked about it in the past, just even before this season, how this will be now when we find out if Ryan Day made the correct choice. And that's one of the things I asked Kyle McCord on Tuesday. Are you going into this game? Do you have to go into this game? How do you keep from going into this game thinking you have to prove your head coach right for choosing you? Because he did. And he chose Kyle McCord over JJ McCarthy. And whenever that is brought up to Ryan Day or Kyle McCord, McCord said that's a recruiting storyline. That is old. We moved past that. That's not something that they talk about. JJ McCarthy, that bothered him. And you saw he took some joy in the win last year over Ohio State. He grew up an Ohio State fan, which is another tiny dagger into his heart. And with Ryan Day choosing McCord over him, so that's one way to fire up a quarterback. And with Kyle McCord, he's not really interested in talking about that. Ryan Day isn't necessarily interested in talking about that. He was asked what was it about one that you chose over the other, and he's like, well, there's lots of things you look for in a quarterback. I'm not going to give you the real answer, but I'll give you something so that you can write it in your newspaper.
Part of that formula, which I'm sure Ohio State won't admit, is Kyle McCord had a pretty good high school receiver that the Buckeyes were also recruiting in Marvin Harrison Jr. And I found it interesting that on Tuesday, Marvin Harrison Jr. said, Kyle McCord committed to Ohio State first. That was great. I didn't want to commit to Ohio State because he was going to be my quarterback. I wanted to commit to Ohio State because he was my friend and I'd be going to a faraway campus and I would know somebody in Kyle McCord. It speaks to the friendship between the two of these who have played football together for a long time now.
Yeah, and those two are very, very tight. I remember talking to Marvin Harrison Sr. at last year's pro day and asking or this spring's pro day, what will Ohio State fans see from Kyle McCord? And he said he's a low key, level headed, good dude, and that's coming from the father of one of his best friends. And he gives a different perspective because he's seen him for many years and many different facets, not just as a quarterback. And that's what Marvin Harrison said. He's not just a quarterback; he's my friend, and he's the same guy he's always been. And I think when you talk to Ryan Day about what is it that you're looking for in a quarterback, one of those things that maybe we don't think about is always being the same guy in terms of whether it's first quarter, fourth quarter, whether you're 0 for 4 starting out, whether you're 4 for 4. Kyle McCord is the same guy. And that's what you need from a quarterback when you're up, when you're down, somebody that you always know what you're going to get in terms of mentality, in terms of response. Teammates always know what they're going to get from Kyle McCord. That's why they look up to him. That's one of the things that makes him such a good leader for this team, because there aren't really any surprises to how he's going to react to the situation.
Seems as if Ohio State is trending up, Michigan trending down based on the last couple of weeks' performance. Should we put much stock into what happens the week before the game?
We probably did last year when Michigan beat Illinois 19-17, struggled doing so, and then came out and did just fine eventually against Ohio State. I think I think Ohio State saw some things from the Michigan defense that made them smile, and then the secondary for Michigan had some issues. This is the first time they'd faced a quarterback that could test them deep, and they tested him pretty well. Ohio State can do that, provided Kyle McCord can get some time. But the week before the game, all bets are off in terms of what happens, and whatever happened in that game is something that is totally different than the focus and the response to the game. So they, as Ryan Day said, they're not even really going to look at last week's film. They'll just look at it a little bit. They'll grade it, but that is long gone. The Minnesota game was long gone shortly after Saturday night, and the Maryland game was long gone for Michigan shortly after Saturday night, because it was all about this game. And whatever happens here isn't the same thing that happened in last week. They're all about right now.
The Ohio State Marching Band will go to Ann Arbor on Saturday, and they will stop in Rossford Friday night for a concert at Rossford High School. So a chance to see the band right here in Northwest Ohio. Looking forward to that, and always looking forward to checking in with Tony Gerdeman from BuckeyeHuddle.com. Gerd, thank you once again, and have a happy Thanksgiving.
And to you as well. Thank you very much.